The mountain did not speak, but it remembered. Fog pressed low against the trees like a held breath, and the hollow remained untouched by roads, law, or mercy. Houses rotted where they stood, their windows dark even at noon, as if the sun had learned not to linger there. People in nearby towns knew the name of the family that lived beyond the ridge, but they spoke it softly, the way one speaks of graves or storms that never truly pass. The father was the last thing in the hollow that still stood upright. His back bent with age, but his shadow stretched long, reaching into every room of the house and every life beneath its roof. He had outlived wives, brothers, and sons, burying them on the slope behind the house where the soil was thin and unforgiving. What remained was blood thick, recycled, and trapped, flowing through halls that smelled of damp wood and old secrets. When the child was born, no bell rang in town and no record was written. She arrived during a night when the rain fell so hard it erased footprints before they could accuse anyone. They said she was the daughter's child, and that was the story given to the mountain. But mountains see more than they repeat. The child's eyes carried something older than they should have, something that looked back through generations rather than forward into life. As she grew, her body told a story no one dared to read aloud. Bones curved where they should have been straight. Her breath came shallow, as if the air itself rejected her. The father watched her with a devotion that felt closer to ownership than care, his hand resting on her shoulder as though confirming she was real, that the blood had not betrayed him. At night, the house groaned under its own weight, beams popping like distant gunshots. The child would lie awake, listening to the mountain breathe, feeling the past coil inside her ribs. She did not yet know what she was, only that she was wrong, and that the wrongness had a name she shared with the man who refused to let her leave. The first signs of the family's curse did not arrive as scandal or proof, but as absence. In the Appalachian hills, where births were celebrated loudly and deaths marked with hand-carved names, this family produced neither announcement nor record. Children were rumored to exist long before anyone saw them, and when they were finally glimpsed, it was often years later, standing barefoot at a distance, watching strangers with an expression that suggested both fear and recognition. The county clerk noticed the gaps first, entire decades where no birth certificates bore the family's name, even though the household grew heavier with footsteps and voices. Midwives stopped being called. Doctors were never summoned. Whatever entered that house did so quietly and stayed hidden. Neighbors spoke of lights burning late in the windows, of crying that rose and fell with the wind, of laundry lines that multiplied even as no new faces appeared in town. Women from nearby hollows whispered that the family did not trust outsiders with their blood, that they believed something in it would be taken if it were ever written down. Over time, the whispers sharpened into something colder. People began to say the family was folding inward, marrying and birthing among themselves, not out of ignorance but out of obedience to an unspoken rule passed from parent to child. The mountain, they claimed, had taught them this, the way isolation teaches animals to eat their own when food runs out. What made the rumors endure was not cruelty, but consistency. Every generation, there were fewer graves than expected and more shadows moving behind the same walls. The children who did appear bore familiar features arranged incorrectly, as if nature were reusing a limited set of parts and growing careless with the pattern. Some limped. Some never spoke. All of them avoided eye contact, as though looking too closely at another person might reveal something they were trying desperately to forget. By the time the father became the head of the family, the reputation was already set like rot in the beams. He did not deny the rumors, nor did he confirm them. He simply closed the gates, pulled the family tighter into the hollow, and let the silence do the work. In Appalachia, silence carries more weight than confession, and as the years passed, the lack of records became proof enough that whatever was being born there was never meant to be known, never meant to leave, never meant to survive in the light. The wife's death did not arrive with sirens or prayers, only with the slow understanding that she would never leave the bedroom again. The mountain swallowed the explanation the way it swallowed everything else, and the hollow accepted it without question. Some said she wasted away. Others believed she fell down the ravine behind the house and was carried off by rain and brush. The father offered no story, and none was demanded. In places like that, survival depended on knowing when not to ask. What mattered was not how she died, but what followed once her voice was gone. Without her, The house changed its rhythm. Meals became quieter, movements more deliberate, laughter a thing remembered rather than heard. The father took over every decision, from when the children slept to where they stood when strangers passed the road below. His word hardened into law, unchallenged and unquestioned, reinforced by the certainty that resistance led nowhere but deeper into the woods. He began to lock doors that had never needed locks, to count heads at night, to sit awake until dawn as though guarding something fragile and dangerous at once. Grief, if it existed, was not shown. Instead, control filled the space where tenderness once lived. The father's presence grew heavier, his attention sharper, his rules stricter with each passing year. He decided who could speak, who could leave the property, who was allowed to grow and who was meant to remain small. Children learned quickly that silence earned safety, and obedience earned survival. The mountain echoed this lesson back to them, teaching through isolation what punishment never had to explain. Neighbors noticed the change even from a distance. The children stopped appearing at the edge of the property. Smoke from the chimney rose at odd hours, signaling sleepless nights and restless vigilance. The father was seen less often in town, and when he did appear, his eyes never lingered, scanning constantly as if measuring threats only he could see. Authority, once shared between husband and wife, had narrowed into something singular and absolute, rooted in fear rather than care. The absence of a woman in the house also erased the last witness. There was no one left to soften the father's decisions or question his reasoning. What he believed became truth, and what he feared became destiny. He spoke often of blood, of legacy, of keeping what belonged to the family within the family. These words were framed as protection, as necessity, as the only way to keep the mountain from taking what little they had left. By the time the children understood that their lives no longer belonged to them, the structure of power was complete. The father stood at its center, immovable and unquestioned, ruling not through violence alone but through the certainty that there was no world beyond the hollow that would ever claim them or save them. The daughter was the one the mountain kept. From early childhood, it was clear she would not follow the paths her siblings eventually took, disappearing into marriages, jobs, or rumors that drifted back only as half-remembered names. While others were permitted to walk down the road toward town, she was always called back, always needed for something inside the house, some chore that could not wait, some rule that applied only to her. At first, the distinction felt accidental, the natural unevenness of family life, but as years passed it hardened into design. She grew up watching the world through frames rather than entering it. Windows, doorways, fence posts became her boundaries. The father said the outside made people weak, said the mountain punished those who wandered too far from their blood. He told her she was different, more fragile, more important, chosen to stay because she understood the hollow better than the others ever could. Praise and restriction were braided together so tightly she could not separate affection from confinement. Each time a sibling left, the grip on her tightened, as though the loss of one required the possession of another. When she reached an age where questions usually bloom, hers were quietly uprooted. She was denied schooling, denied friendships, denied the simple act of being seen by anyone who did not share her last name. The father controlled her reflection as much as her movement, deciding what she wore, how she spoke, when she slept. Even her body ceased to feel like her own, monitored constantly under the pretense of protection. The mountain reinforced the lesson, surrounding the house with steep slopes and dense trees that made escape feel less like a possibility and more like a legend. What truly marked her separation was the fear instilled in her about leaving. She was told stories of girls who stepped beyond the hollow and were ruined by the world, their minds poisoned, their blood tainted. The father spoke of shame as if it were a physical disease, one that could enter through contact, through curiosity, through disobedience. Over time, the idea of departure became inseparable from terror, and the road out of the hollow transformed in her mind into a threat rather than a promise. As the others faded from daily memory, she became the fixed point around which the household revolved. Her presence justified the father's vigilance, his rules, his isolation. She learned to measure time not by seasons or birthdays, but by his moods and silences. In being kept, she was also shaped, molded into someone who no longer knew whether staying was a sentence or a duty, only that leaving had been made unthinkable. The child's birth was handled the way everything else in the hollow was handled, quietly and without witnesses who might remember it wrong. The daughter was taken into the back room during a night when the wind pressed hard against the walls, and by morning there was a new cry in the house that no one acknowledged aloud. When the father told the few neighbors who still spoke to him that his daughter had given birth, his voice carried no surprise, only expectation, as if this outcome had been waiting patiently for its turn. No one questioned the timing or the circumstances, because questions had long ago learned not to survive there. At first, the story held. In the mountains, daughters became mothers early, and hardship aged bodies faster than calendars. But as the child grew, the lie began to strain under its own weight. Her face carried lines that echoed the father's too precisely to dismiss. The set of her jaw, the distance between her eyes, even the way her brow furrowed when she cried mirrored his expressions with an accuracy that unsettled anyone who noticed. People who visited once and never returned felt it before they could name it, a wrongness that sat just beneath the surface, waiting to be recognized. The father noticed it too, and instead of fear, it filled him with something closer to reverence. He watched the child as though she were proof made flesh, confirmation that blood obeyed him more faithfully than law or nature ever could. He corrected anyone who held her incorrectly, who spoke to her too softly or too loudly, asserting a claim that exceeded what any grandfather should feel. The daughter, weakened from the birth and hollowed out by years of control, was reduced further, her role rewritten overnight from kept child to invisible vessel. Officially, the child belonged to her mother. In practice, she belonged to him. He chose her name, fed her first, decided when she slept and when she was allowed to be seen. When illness came, as it often did, he refused outside help, insisting that what grew from his blood could only be treated by his hands. The mountain watched this exchange without judgment, having witnessed worse bargains struck for survival. Inside the house, however, the truth began to press in on itself, warping the air, bending every interaction around what could not be spoken. As the child learned to walk, then to speak, the resemblance only deepened, and with it the unspoken understanding that the family line had crossed a boundary it could never uncross. The daughter avoided mirrors. The father sought them. Between them stood a child who carried not just a future, but a past folded violently into her body, living evidence that the bloodline had stopped moving forward and begun consuming itself. As the girl grew, the mountain seemed to age her faster than time should have allowed. Illness clung to her like damp air, settling into her lungs, her joints, her skin. Fevers came without warning and left her thinner each time, as though something inside her was slowly erasing itself. She bruised easily, bones bending under small accidents that should have left nothing more than scrapes. The father called it weakness inherited from the mother, but the mother knew better, even if she could not name it. She saw how the child's body struggled to assemble itself properly, how each year added not strength but strain. The community noticed in fragments. When the girl was briefly seen near the road, her gait was uneven, her shoulders sloped unnaturally, her face pale in a way that did not match the seasons. Children her age outpaced her easily, while she lagged behind, breathing hard, eyes fixed downward. Some said she was sickly by birth. Others whispered that the blood had gone bad, turned sour from being used too many times without change. No one said the truth aloud, but it hovered in every glance and half-finished sentence. Doctors were never consulted. The father dismissed the idea with contempt, insisting outsiders would only interfere, only weaken what little resilience the child possessed. Remedies were homemade and ineffective, passed down through generations that had already proven their failure. When pain bent the girl double, she was told to endure it, that endurance was proof of belonging. Each sickness became another reason to keep her hidden, another justification for isolation, until her world shrank to the walls of the house and the stretch of land she could cross without collapsing. What frightened the mother most were the signs that could not be blamed on chance. The girl's features continued to echo the same patterns, repeating themselves with increasing distortion. Teeth crowded her mouth. Fingers curved slightly inward. Her vision blurred early, her hearing dulled, as though her senses themselves were retreating. These were not injuries, but inheritances, passed down with relentless precision. The bloodline was no longer just repeating, it was deteriorating, folding its mistakes into the next generation without correction. As the years passed, the girl began to understand that her pain was not temporary. She watched other children grow stronger while she remained fragile, her body a constant reminder that something fundamental had gone wrong before she ever took her first breath. She learned to move carefully, to ration her energy, to live within the limits imposed on her flesh. In quiet moments, she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling an irregular rhythm that seemed to carry echoes older than her own life, as though her heart itself struggled to carry the weight of too much history in too small a body. The midwife arrived only because the mountain forced the issue. The girl's illnesses had grown too frequent, her breathing too shallow, and one winter night the mother broke the rule of silence and sent for help. The woman who came was old, her hands steady from decades of delivering children the county preferred not to think about. She asked few questions and accepted fewer answers, watching more than she listened. From the moment she saw the child, something tightened in her expression, a recognition shaped by experience rather than rumor. Her examination was slow and careful, lingering over details most would dismiss. She noted the curvature of the spine, the irregular spacing of the eyes, the weakness in the joints that should have firmed with age. She listened to the girl's chest and frowned at the uneven rhythm, a sound she had heard before in families where bloodlines collapsed inward. When she asked about the father, the room grew colder. The mother's silence confirmed more than words ever could. The midwife had seen what happens when lineage turns back on itself, when names repeat not just on paper but in flesh. She knew the signs of inherited damage multiplied rather than diluted, of traits resurfacing not as echoes but as fractures. What unsettled her most was how precisely the child reflected the father, not as a grandchild should, but as something closer, something folded too tightly into the same genetic space. The girl was not simply descended from him. She was built from him twice, carrying a burden her body had never been meant to bear. When she spoke, her voice was low, measured, stripped of judgment. She told the mother that the bloodline had narrowed beyond repair, that the child was paying for choices made long before she existed. She explained that when the same blood is reused, again and again, it loses its ability to correct itself. Mistakes accumulate. Strength decays. The body becomes a ledger of past violations. The girl's suffering was not random illness, but the visible consequence of a lineage that had begun consuming itself. The father rejected every word. He accused the midwife of ignorance, of fear, of trying to poison what he called destiny. He claimed the mountain had always demanded sacrifice, and that weakness was simply the price of purity. The midwife looked at him with something close to pity. She had heard that logic before too, always spoken by those who benefited most from it. Before she left, she pressed her hand gently against the girl's forehead and met her eyes, seeing understanding there that no child should possess. She did not offer hope, only truth, and in doing so sealed the knowledge that the child was not just sick, but symbolic, living proof that the family's blood had turned inward and begun to rot from its own repetition. After the midwife left, the father's behavior shifted from secrecy to conviction. Where others might have recoiled from the truth, he leaned into it, reshaping it into something that resembled purpose. He began to speak of the child not as a mistake or consequence, but as confirmation. In his mind, she was no longer evidence of decay but of selection, proof that the mountain had chosen his blood to endure in a way no other families had. He framed the narrowing of the lineage as refinement, insisting that what others called corruption was simply weakness being stripped away. He treated the girl with a reverence that unsettled even the mother. His touch lingered too long, his gaze weighed too heavily, as if he were studying a relic rather than caring for a child. He watched her movements closely, cataloguing every similarity between them, every gesture that mirrored his own. When she spoke, he listened as though her words carried authority beyond her years. He told her she was special, that she carried the family inside her more completely than anyone else ever had. The praise was constant and suffocating, leaving no room for doubt or refusal. The father's belief hardened into ritual. He insisted the girl eat certain foods, avoid certain places, sleep in rooms he selected. He discouraged contact with anyone who might introduce alternative explanations for her suffering. Pain, he told her, was not something to escape but something to endure, a sign that the blood was being tested. When she cried, he reminded her that survival had always required sacrifice, and that the mountain rewarded those who accepted their role without question. In private moments, He spoke of legacy as though it were alive, moving through generations like a spirit seeking a vessel. He convinced himself that the child's existence was not an accident but a convergence, the culmination of years of isolation and obedience. Where others saw a line collapsing, he saw a circle closing perfectly, blood returning to its source. This belief insulated him from guilt, allowing him to reinterpret harm as inevitability and control as guardianship. The mother grew quieter, shrinking further into herself as the father's certainty expanded. Any attempt to challenge him was dismissed as weakness or betrayal. He accused her of failing to understand the mountain, of lacking the strength required to protect what was theirs. Over time, resistance became impossible, smothered beneath the weight of his conviction. For the girl, the father's devotion became another form of confinement. She learned that her worth was tied to her suffering, that her pain validated his beliefs. She carried his expectations as heavily as she carried her illness, sensing that she was no longer simply living her own life, but serving as proof of a destiny she never chose. The deaths began quietly at first, passing almost unnoticed in a house already accustomed to shadows. A cousin taken by fever, a brother lost to the woods during a hunting trip, a neighbor's warning of sickness that came too late. The family had learned to accept absence without questioning it, and the father's authority made it unnecessary to mourn loudly. Yet each loss tightened the air in the hollow, made the walls feel lower, the windows darker. Something invisible seemed to coil around the family, pressing them inward even as the father insisted it was protection. Every death was followed by another birth, a pattern that both frightened and justified the father. The girl's younger siblings were born with irregularities more pronounced than before, each one carrying traces of deformity or fragility that had skipped previous generations. These births were heralded not as miracles, but as continuations of a line already frayed at its edges. The father interpreted them as signs, proof that the family's endurance required this cyclical process of loss and replacement. In his mind, the mountain demanded balance. For each life that left, another must enter, carrying the same blood and the same burden. The mother watched in silence as the pattern repeated. She saw how the father's focus sharpened with each child, how his attention moved from mourning to calculation, from grief to strategy. He spoke less of care and more of destiny, as if the deaths were neither tragedy nor misfortune but evidence that the family's bloodline required constant pruning to survive. She noticed the child, the one born from her own daughter, grow ever more central in his plans, a living proof that the cycle was intentional rather than accidental. The girl herself began to understand, in ways words could not convey, that the lives around her were expendable, that each body leaving the hollow made room for another to carry the same weight. She learned the subtle rhythms of loss, which doors would remain closed, which whispers could be trusted, which moments of quiet meant someone had gone without notice. Fear became a constant companion, a lens through which she viewed every birth and every death. She began to anticipate loss the way others anticipate sunrise, knowing that life and decay existed in equal measure, bound together by invisible rules. The father's obsession with the cycle intensified. He monitored the children as if tracking both numbers and essence, measuring their growth against what had been lost. When a child succumbed to illness or injury, he did not grieve in ways others might recognize. He catalogued, he corrected, he prepared the family for the next birth. In the hollow, life and death became indistinguishable from duty, and the girl understood that she herself was part of the calculation, a proof that the cycle was unbroken, that the bloodline endured even as it consumed itself. By the time the granddaughter reached the edge of understanding, she could feel the weight of the house pressing into her chest, shaping her thoughts before words could form. She watched her reflection in cracked mirrors and the darkened surface of the stove, noting the same eyes, the same sloping shoulders, the same small gestures inherited not from a mother or aunt, but from the father whose blood ran twice through her veins. The knowledge settled slowly, like cold stone inside her ribs. She was not meant to exist in the world beyond the hollow, that her very body carried the proof of a lineage turned inward. Her days were measured by the rules of the father, whose presence filled every room, whose gaze could transform a simple glance into judgment. She learned to move carefully, to speak only when permitted, to exist in ways that did not draw attention. In moments of quiet, when the house seemed to exhale its long-held tension, she pressed her hands to her own chest and felt the pulse of inherited history, the echo of lives compressed into her fragile body. There was a sense of inevitability in her every breath, a knowledge that she was living both as continuation and as consequence. Outside, the world moved forward while she remained anchored in repetition. Children of the village aged and learned, walked to school and into adulthood, but she existed in a suspended time, marked by the same illnesses, deformities, and restrictions that had defined generations. She recognized herself in her siblings and cousins, though even they were only partial mirrors. In her, the cycle had folded in most completely, leaving her body and mind as repositories for the family's mistakes and obsessions. The father treated her both as evidence and as heir. He spoke of her as proof that his choices, his control, his adherence to the mountain's unspoken law, were righteous. Each lesson, each restriction, each act of surveillance became a reaffirmation of the same destiny that had trapped generations before her. The girl began to see the duality of her existence. She was both subject and witness, living example and silent historian of a bloodline that could not escape itself. Fear and understanding merged in her awareness. She did not yet have the language to name the horror, but she felt it in every motion, every glance, every sigh that passed through the hollow. The legacy she carried was more than genetic, it was moral, spiritual, and inevitable. She realized that she had been created not to live freely, but to embody the history of the family, the culmination of decisions and sins that predated her birth. And as she looked around the dimly lit rooms that had always contained her, she sensed that nothing would change, that she was caught in the same pattern that had claimed all who came before, and that her own body had already begun to mark the continuation of a fate she could neither escape nor alter. The bloodline's secret did not die quietly, it revealed itself slowly, like rot pushing through the boards of an old floor. Outside the hollow, whispers had begun to stir, carried on the wind from neighbors who had glimpsed shadows too many times, from travelers who had noticed a child whose features were too familiar in ways that should have been impossible. But it was not confession that brought the truth into light. The family had no one left to confess to, and the mountain had already swallowed every stray word. Instead, the revelation came through collapse, through the slow, inevitable unraveling of a household bound by secrecy, isolation, and inherited weakness. The house itself seemed to betray them. Roof beams sagged under their own age, windows cracked, floors creaked and shifted as if the structure itself could no longer contain the weight of generations pressed too tightly together. Illness and deformity had claimed more than bodies, they had claimed routine, order, and vigilance. The father's eyes, once sharp and controlling, began to fail him in ways he refused to acknowledge. Meals were left untouched, chores forgotten, and the careful rotations of observation and correction that had maintained the family for decades began to falter. The girl, the child who carried the father's blood twice, grew older, her understanding deepening alongside the deterioration around her. She observed patterns the adults pretended not to notice, recognized the fatal repetitions in the births and deaths, and felt the invisible pressure of a lineage that had folded in on itself. Her body, her very existence, was proof enough. And as the father weakened, his control slipping in ways he could not prevent, the pattern that had once been hidden behind rules and fear became unavoidable. Every sickness, every deformity, every faltering step and shallow breath spoke louder than any story, louder than any lie the family could maintain. The mother, long silent, began to allow herself glimpses of truth. She saw that the cycle could not be concealed any longer, that the house's decay mirrored the corruption within its walls. And the neighbors, drawn by glimpses and rumors, began to connect the dots, small, almost imperceptible signs that had accumulated over decades. They did not need full confession to understand what had occurred, the evidence had always been there, carried in bodies, shadows, and the air of the hollow itself. In the end, the bloodline revealed itself not through words but through the slow collapse of all the structures that had protected it. Authority faltered, bodies weakened, and the hidden lineage could no longer be maintained as secret. The mountain remained, silent and unyielding, witnessing the decay, the suffering, and the persistence of a bloodline that had consumed itself, leaving behind nothing but the record of its own repetition and a hollow that would forever carry the echoes of generations trapped within a destiny they could neither alter nor escape.